Basically, this is going to be my observations on using the ancient woodland inventory. Since it existed, I'm sadly old enough to remember when it first came into light, and what the source material was like that they had to work on, which for the time was, it was a hell of an undertaking. And I don't want you to take away from this presentation that it's a total criticism of it. It was just of its time, and obviously things have moved on. Just as a brief introduction to what I do with Woodland Trust Scotland, along with my colleague Alan, who's also in the audience, we deal with outreach work, so we engage private landowners, other NGOs, and I suppose anybody who wants to listen, engage them in trying to get them to restore ancient woodlands or manage them sustainably. I prefer to use the term ancient and native woodland because, like Richard, this nomenclature and sort of designations I think labels aren't that helpful to some degree. So we, unlike the Forestry and Land Scotland, every time we go to a new landowner, we're sort of visiting a new site, so we're starting from scratch every single time. So it's starting from ground zero and having to look at the evidence about what the status of the woodland is, how biodiverse it is, and so we have to deal with the complexities of the current ancient woodland inventory on a regular basis and how it relates to the situation on the ground. I like to think of the term ancient woodland as a proxy for high biodiversity value. It's just a label amongst other labels, and I think that that's how we should view it rather than trying to sort of pigeonhole things with a high degree of certainty, because the more you look into this sort of subject, the greyer it gets around definitions and what have you. So looking at the inventory as it stands, these are some of my observations on what the drawbacks are of it and why we need to look at further evidence. So obviously when the ancient woodland inventory was first established, there were lots of things that were left out of it. That is the Cadzow Oak, sort of near Shattle Road Country Park, probably one of the most should be one of the most iconic woodlands in Scotland, but doesn't appear on the inventory. I would argue that it is more than 20% tree cover, so therefore should be classed as woodland. But as Richard said previously, all these wood pasture sites, old wood pasture sites, have been, weren't included in the original inventory, which was a shame because it kind of ignores a lot of our ancient and veteran trees. And also there's been a lot of, I suppose, mistagging of the woodland categories within the inventory as well, because there's a lot of confusion between pause sites and ancient semi-natural sites, partly due to the fact that they used old black and white aerial photographs to categorise some of this stuff. So a young larch plantation in black and white at certain times of the year doesn't look that much different from a broadleaved plantation. So as you go around the country and look at these sites, there's an awful lot of areas which have been tagged as pause, when in fact they're ancient semi-natural, the broadleaves, and vice versa, ancient semi-natural woodlands that should have been called pause because they do actually have conifers on. So there's a bit of confusion. And in the Scottish borders, apparently that's when the resources ran out for the whole survey process, so a lot of stuff was done in a hurry and a lot of stuff in the borders was actually missed out, just because people were just trying to get the inventory finished, and it was a bit of a rush job, unfortunately. It's interesting to note that wood pasture and smaller woodland fragments are now being included in the rollout of the revamp of the English ancient woodland inventory, which we welcome, obviously. Smaller fragmented woodlands, they can be really important biodiversity reservoirs in a sort of wider unwooded landscape. A lot of these smaller woodlands have been left out of the inventory, and also riparian strips. When you think about climate change, the effects on water temperature due to lack of tree cover, along riparian strips. A lot of these riparian strips, although very small and very narrow, are vitally important for, you know, keeping water quality, water temperatures down. You know, it's part of this whole sort of critical business with salmonoids. And it's ironically, if you look at maps of water temperature and sort of critical areas where salmonids are decreasing and under increasing threat, it's almost counterintuitive that a lot of those watercourses and riparian areas are actually in north and northwest Scotland, where you'd think it would be cooler, but actually there's less trees, and therefore aquatic life is under greater threat. So the riparian strips are equally as important and ought to be recognised, even if they're just a few trees, and would act as a basis for kind of wider scale environmental enhancement. Ghostwoods, that's an example from up in Sutherland, and in recent historical terms, this whole area here and over here was part of a much wider wooded landscape, and over the last 50 or 60 years it's almost completely gone through deer overgrazing and something that's kind of more prevalent up in the northwest, and perhaps people don't realise it quite so often, fire as well. There was a major burn that went through there 15 years ago, which did for a lot of the sort of smaller trees and younger regeneration. So you've got about, you know, a dozen trees left there from what was a bigger landscape of trees. But having said that, the basis for the wood, the soils are all still there. It's got, you know, bracken cover in parts, and there's kind of woodland, kind of specialist flora in the area as well. So it's kind of another site that could act as a sort of a reservoir for enhancing the landscape and expanding the woodland. And importantly, as again, it's something that's very prevalent in North and West Scotland, not down here, obviously, but cliff woodlands, purely because they don't appear on aerial photographs because they're in shadow a lot. And anything with a northeast aspect that's fairly steep in kind of the highlands is virtually invisible. And these two pictures show examples from the Isle of Egg, which actually is ringed by gorgeous hazelwoods, which don't even appear on the Ordnance Survey maps, bizarrely, because most of the time they're in shadow. So you can see this area here, large woodland here and large woodland there, and it continues around to the northern end of the island, is just off the map, literally off the map. So, you know, how can you protect something that you don't even know it's there? It's a bit of a bizarre one. And historically, things like, you know, hazel weren't really classed as trees if you go back far enough. So there's this kind of preconception that maybe hazel woods weren't as important as we realise they are now. So a couple of case studies. This is an example of a wood we picked at random, really, for an induction session with a Borders Forest Trust staff member, just to look at ancient woodland around about Galashiels. So this is along the Gala Water north of Galashiels, and Borders Forest Trust had previously done some work at Williams Law in this section of the wood. So I went with Nikki and we had a poke around in the wood across the way, and it was kind of, yeah, it was pretty stupendous. Had a really rich W10, W8 vegetation, and even had some small leaf lime in there. Whether that's been planted or not, we can't prove either way. So it kind of got the grey cells going, thinking, you know, there's something happening here. You know, it had large fallen dead wood, old standing dead wood, interesting species like small leaf lime. You know, the ground floor was really nice, full of specialist woodland flora, and it felt right. You know, thinking is this an ancient woodland? So we did some research. So that's the first edition OS. And this area here is down as ancient woodland on the inventory, close by. So, you know, we've got out the Roy maps and kind of analysed them a little bit and tried to interpret what they actually showed, given the sort of drawbacks which we've all discussed about the Roy maps. And just looked at the kind of Gala water catchment, sort of from Gala Shields going north. And lo and behold, there were, you know, the areas in red, the areas in dark green are on the inventory, but the areas in red are, you know, potential ancient woodlands that have been missed off the Roy, no, not have been missed off the Roy map, but missed off the inventory, because they seem to appear on the Roy map in various guises, and they're on the 1860s maps, but somehow seem to sort of got lost on the inventory. So there's been to one or two of the other woods, and again, you know, there's quite a decent ground floor. So there's possibilities there that there's quite a lot more ancient woodland in that area than is actually previously known. And I think, I've come to this opinion over many years, that ancient woodland is very different in a lowland and an upland situation. It's almost like chalk and cheese. In a lowland situation, you have woods which have existed in the same place continuously for hundreds of years. It's an extreme example, but that's Cranbourne Chase down in Dorset, and you can look at an OS map now and see just about all of that. It's enclosed, it's static, it's where it is, and it's been there for, that map dates from the early 17th century. It was obviously there a long time before that as a hunting forest. So you've got that very long period of continuity and ecological development in one place. And this is the other extreme, I suppose, is kind of it shows it's an area just near Ardguy, actually, heading up into the hills, where you've got, on the first edition OS, scattered hill populations of Scots pines spreading out from the coast up into the hill. And we went there as part of the Croft Woodland project to look at this, a croft that a woman owned. Oh, it was just here. And, you know, the pine trees there are absolutely staggering. These trees still are there in a lot of cases. You know, with juniper, lovely ground floor where it wasn't getting grazed by stock. And you do question, you know, is it a native pine wood site? I don't know, but, you know, it's, and looking on the Roy map, you know, there was, you know, there's kind of indications of green colouring. Was it a wood? I don't know, but it's kind of an example of a mobile woodland system that's obviously, as, you know, Richard said previously, you know, you've got a main wood, you've got a regeneration fronts moving ahead of it, above it, sort of mobile system, and then you quite often in cases, you'll see in the Cairngorms, it has a vapour trail of old granny pines going behind it, so it gradually shifts over time. So 300 years ago it might have been in one place, and now it's, you know, a quarter of a mile further on, and it's all moving. And then you get all the ecotones around that, around, you know, boundaries between mature veteran trees, younger regeneration, the open hill, and it's continually moving, which is probably the nearest we get to a functioning landscape in that sort of situation. Is possibly what we should be aiming for. How you classify that in terms of ancient woodland gets a bit grey, because it's not static. So yes, following on a sort of kind of upland case study, this is Kinvecchi Estate, which Alan surveyed a while ago, and I've been using this as a test, sort of experimental base, to see whether LiDAR can pick up woodland regeneration at a sort of sufficient level that you can start to map stuff. So I've been over this area quite a lot. So particularly sort of this area, it doesn't really show up in this light, but there's patches of pine which fall outside that's 2A, lots of it 2A. The only bit of 1A is that a tiny little patch there, which I'm not quite sure how that relates to the Roy map at all. But there's kind of fairly extensive areas of stuff that's on the first edition OS, but the inventory is missed off some significant areas of Caledonian pine. So this is looking at the Roy map. Unfortunately, the georeferencing completely broke down in this area. But if you kind of use the basis, these two streams coming down from the Donlane River, you can roughly place the area of Kinvecchi in here. So it did have pine trees on it at the time. And it might have been part of, again, this kind of mobile system of kind of mature trees. It might have been semi-clear felled because, obviously timber extraction goes back a long way, many centuries in that part of the world. We just don't know. So there is a basis for an ancient woodland there. The 1860s map shows something of far larger in extent. And again, we're looking at this block here. So, it kind of indicates that it's something that moves and is not static. And what the problem I have with looking at ancient woodland or native woodland is, we're basing things on two little snapshots in time of a kind of continuum of movement, of management, of grazing pressures, and it's very difficult to actually piece together what's actually happened. Just because we don't have it mapped every 5 years from 1700, which would have probably told us the full story. And that's what it looks like today. So you've got clumps of trees, you've got a good scatter of old granny trees there, and you've also got a lot of new regeneration that's so a lot of it's fairly young actually. The Seafield estates have put in a practice of pretty well shooting on sight in that area on Kinvecchi. So deer are being kept out of the system altogether, almost. Obviously it's not fenced, so deer can get in and out, but they're dealt with fairly ruthlessly at the moment, and it's allowing this massive flush of regeneration coming away. So what we've got is a kind of mobile woodland system on an ancient site. How you classify that is up to yourselves, but to my mind, that's the ecological restoration, is this kind of recreation of a kind of ecosystem that's starting to sort of kick fire again and starting to sort of take off, and probably replicating what's happened over the last few centuries. You've got this moving zones of trees of various ages. You've got different age structures, you've got the ecotones between the different groups of trees. In terms of ground floor, there's not much difference between what's there and what's on the open hill, but I think in a lot of upland cases, ground floor has been really heavily modified. A lot of sites I go to, both by overgrazing by sheep and then deer when deer forests were established, and also fire. This sits adjacent to a grouse moor which is still being burnt. Less intensively maybe than it was in the past, but fire has had an impact here, and as has grazing. So that all acts to kind of homogenise to a sort of lower common denominator of woodland plants that are still there. So the big questions, Richard's already mentioned LIPO, and I would agree that we have LIPO designation on the ancient woodland inventory, but each one needs to be looked at on a site-by-site basis, because you've got a whole hodgepodge of woodland types within there, from stuff that's quite obviously, Victorian plantation that's maybe had a couple of rotations of conifers, all the way through to stuff that, as Richard said, has obviously been developed around an ancient woodland complex, by sort of woodland improvement, planting of conifers in a lot of cases, and it's very difficult to piece out what has actually happened in some of these cases. So you've got to go and do site surveys, have a look at what biodiversity is there, and really sort of tear apart the designation a little bit. So treat them as on a case-by-case basis. And as I said, how does vegetation fit into this? And I think ground flora has been really heavily modified over time in a lot of the highlands by overgrazing and fire. Probably not as modified as kind of lowlands around here, but it's a case for the majority of the country. And it's worth remembering that ancient woodland is not all about trees and flora. I think we get really hung up on ancient woodland indicators and tree species, but we shouldn't forget the soil that underpins all this. So soil, fungal associations, mycorrhizal associations, and lots of biodiversity that we know it's there, but it's very, very difficult to actually quantify what is actually under our feet. And that's, the woodland soil that's developed over centuries, if not thousands of years, is actually the driving force behind woodland development. I think foresters these days quite often forget about soil, but it's the base of everything, really. And I think the restoration and management should focus on re-establishing a functioning ecosystem. We're not trying to get back to something that existed 100, 200, 300 years ago, but we've got a baseline of now, and from now on we should be sort of managing to, I suppose, improve and enhance what we have. And that means starting from, a new baseline, rather than trying to, the restoration word is quite misleading. We should be looking at a functioning ecosystem, whatever that might happen to be in 100 or 200 years. Another message, how can we protect ancient woodland when we don't know where it all is? It's particularly pertinent to areas where there's strong pressure from development. There's been quite a few high-profile cases in the Upper Spey Valley around Nethy Bridge and places where people have tried to, put development plans ahead in what could be considered ancient woodland sites, but it's not on the map. Therefore, planners don't take that into account. And I was speaking to Julie earlier on, and we're saying, planning control is where most of the sort of protection around ancient woodland actually lies. It's on the MPPF. You shouldn't reduce the amount of ancient woodland. But the problem is with planners, they need to know where it is. If it's on a map, fine. If it's not on a map, then you've got real problems trying to prove that actually is ancient and worthy of saving. And I would echo Richard's plea that we really need an updated inventory based upon the improved evidence that we have nowadays. The old inventory is, let's face it, it's 50 years old. Time has moved on. The tools to develop an inventory have moved on. And, with upcoming, developments of satellite technology all the time, it's far easier to map stuff now than it was. And we've got GIS, which we didn't before. And we've moved on from photocopiers and tracing paper. So let's do something, hopefully, that's better and gives us all a basis for our work on sort of woodland protection and sustainable woodland management. Thank you.